So we're here today in Barry with some really exciting news. We're in Eto and I'm joined today with Phyl Griffiths, the chair of YesCymru, and Mark Hooper, local councillor, and also who's been organising the upcoming march. And yeah, there's been some really exciting news recently, isn't there? Shall I let you?
Yep, yeah. I'll open then, if I may. Yes, really exciting. The poll that YesCymru commissioned recently, so that we could get an idea of where we're at now with regards to support for independence, has come back really favourably in favour. So we've seen a growth in support compared to the poll that we conducted last year. So it's up about 4 points, I believe. And there's also other, very interesting trends within the responses to the poll that indicate something that we've, suspected for a long time, really, that, the biggest support for independence is amongst the younger generation. So, yeah, really exciting times.
Yeah, that's my sort of age group. I'm 26, and when I saw the news come in, it was not too much of a surprise to me. I was saying to my partner, when I go back to Swansea and speak to some of my friends that aren't that political, like everyone I know is behind this, and I feel like there's a whole generation that's really been sort of left behind, and the union hasn't worked for them, and this is just so indicative of that, really, isn't it? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Mark.
We've got 72% of the 25 to 34-year-old age group support independence now. And I think that tells a real story, and it tells a story of differences. So you've got 80% of people who are over 65 are against independence, and 72 of this age group are supporting. You've got one group that's done very well in their lives. Forget about whether it's the union. Their lives have they've been able to afford houses, they've been able to bring up a family. And now young people are looking at this and they're thinking, how can I afford a house? How can I ever get in a position where I can bring up a family in a way that I was brought up? And these challenges, I think, are really behind some of this, because it's not just, for me, this isn't even just a cry for independence. This is a cry for we want something better. And I think the challenge for us in this movement is to start to put something better together, because it can't go on like this. And actually, I think the risk on the other side is that these groups could get radicalised in a bad way too, because frankly, the thing doesn't work. So, it's up to us now as people who believe that we're better off doing things outside, without Westminster, to start building better. So it's hugely exciting. And, and there's even some more news as well, isn't there, Phil, which is exciting.
Yes, I think when you put it in the context of potentially Wales rejoining the European Union, so that then what you've got then is a post-independence scenario, then the support is higher again, and that's coming at 51%. So obviously YesCymru doesn't take a view on whether or not we rejoin the EU post-independence, but it just goes to show that if you put things in place, then certain scenarios, so that people can see beyond the independence event itself, then it does help to form opinion around that, and it gathers more support then consequently.
Yeah, it's part of creating that sort of vision that Mark was talking about. This is what an independent Wales could look like in the future, and these are the options that we would have on the table if we had control over Wales itself, essentially, which is really exciting. And then it's the first time as well that the figure's been higher than 40% generally, which is exciting. Yes,
hugely exciting, really encouraging, and that we're not holding a sort of a minority view anymore, because it's all my life sort of due to my father more than anything else. This idea of independence for Wales has been seen as some sort of nationalist pipe dream, and nothing more than that, and just been seen as a bunch of weirdos. So to see now that it's coming into mainstream discussion and that people are taking it seriously now is hugely encouraging, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, I think we'll hopefully see, some of that turnout, and how this isn't just a sort of a fringe movement in the march coming up that's in Barry soon that you've been helping to organise as well. So yeah, how are you feeling about that?
So I'm really glad you brought up the march. So 26th of April, on the Saturday, we've got a march for independence. This is, I think, is it the 6th or 7th march for independence? So,
Gosh, I could try to
so there's been so many we've lost count.
Yeah.
But we're expecting thousands of people to walk outside of this street calling for independence and calling for something better. There was another really interesting part to this whole conversation as well, that previously lots of people and lots of friends I've got in the Labour Party have always said to me, when Scotland goes, we'll then start to move on.
Yeah.
But there's an interesting stat that shows that Scotland going is no longer a decision that changes people's minds here in Wales. So it's about us doing things ourselves. It's about independence of spirit that then builds into this. And I think that for the Labour Party now is a real challenge for them. 49% of their voters at the general election say they support independence. So they need to really think about things like when stuff happens in Westminster that they don't stand up to, the impact that will have on them and their voters.
Yeah. And we don't want to be reliant on what happens in Scotland anyway. This needs to be about Wales and how people in Wales feel and deciding our own future, and tying it in too closely with what's happening in Scotland ultimately reinforces this idea of the union, really, doesn't it? We need to decide our own fate.
Yeah, totally. I've just done a quick tally up there now, so Barry will be number 8.
Brilliant.
Exciting.
So really excited about that. I've been to all of them so far, so I'm really excited that, we don't want to be doing this forever, mind. These independence marches, while they're brilliant and, a fantastic feel-good factor, and, they do pull more people into the movement then, and, more conversations happen around that. Obviously we all want to see the day when we no longer need to march for independence because we're there. So yes.
Yeah. No.
Do some questions?
Yeah, we can open up to questions if anyone wants to ask anything.
Okay. Well, as you say, there is a big generational difference between support for independence, and as Mark points out, 80% of people who are over 65 are against it. And you make the point about them being, probably quite satisfied people with their lives. They probably own their own homes directly without a mortgage and all that sort of stuff. But in order to win a referendum, you'd have to win over quite a lot of those people, unless the strategy is to wait until they're dead. How do you win over these people who, as you put it, are self-satisfied? Because without a substantial swing in that age group, there's no way that you're going to win a referendum.
So, can I have a first go?
Yeah, you go.
I agree with the point. I think there is some, we need to go and make the case, I think that lots of those people who are in that position have children and grandchildren who are struggling this now, so there's a case of how do you make sure this works for future generations. I think the other part of this, though, is recognising that while they think that things are going well, society is changing. So the society that they want to be part of is becoming more tricky. People are, when you get a society that's starting to break down, it affects things more broadly, and that will affect their lives and their concerns. So I think this is a broader question of actually we want to make, for me, an independent Wales needs to be a better Wales for the people who live here. I think our flag's better than the British flag, but that's not good enough. It needs to make a material difference. That's what I'm interested in. And I think that applies to people who are over 65 as much as it does to people who are 25 to 34.
There's probably evidence, isn't there, that people of that age group are more likely to be lured by reform at the moment than they are by Plaid. So how do you think Plaid can change its offer in order to defeat reform in that sort of age group particularly?
I think there is also a role for young people in this. Is like young people need to go out and have these conversations with the older generation, whether that's Plaid supporters on the door or people, just talking to their own families and so on, about how different, my future, our future is from what my grandma was planning, for example. And it's a conversation I've been having with her. She's from Sheffield and she moved to Wales and so on. And I finally got her on board with it. But it's highlighting how bleak the future has been for my generation and how there's just been crisis after crisis and just growing inequality and so on. And just talking to people and not discounting them. And I think, you know, when it comes to the rise of reform as well, it's even more important, because we can't just turn to these people and think, oh, they're not like me, or they're this or that, or so on, and just isolate them. It's about having a national conversation and getting really into these conversations and being willing to have them. And I think, you know, I've been trying to get more young people doing this in Cardiff, and I think, you know, results like this hopefully will motivate other young people to have this conversation all across Wales with the older generation as well.
Yeah, I think on the topic of reform, I think, you know, it's everyone's duty basically to try and have these conversations with people, because reform offers nothing for Wales, for the people of Wales, and that's all they do is they hold up a mirror, you know, to people's anger and frustrations, and they just reflect it back at them, and beyond that there's nothing. There is nothing. There's no hope. There's no progressive plan about, you know, what they'd like to do for Welsh communities. So I think we need to, you know, make sure that, you know, we drive that message home, and that people vote sensibly then when it comes to it. With regards to the older generation then, I think, you know, from what we've seen with the percentages of younger people being in support of independence, that's great. And traditionally then, when it comes to Westminster and Senedd voting, you will have more of the older people, you know, go into the ballot boxes rather than the younger people. So I'm very encouraged by the, you know, the figure for the under 65s, which has come back as 49%. And I think you know, you do get more people traditionally willing to support for something than vote against something. So I think, you know, it's much easier to rally behind a positive message than it is just to be, you know, hang up in negativity all the time.
A couple of years ago, Plaid Cymru published a document which was talking about the realistic route forward for independence. And it actually suggested, didn't it, that there would be tough times for an independent Wales initially. Doesn't that make it more difficult to sell to people, because we've seen what's happened with the Labour Party and how its support has dissolved to a large extent since the general election last year, when people were hoping for so much better. People are very anxious to get material improvements to their lives, and, you know, is it a good message, or is it a winnable message to say to people, yes, we want you to vote for Welsh independence, but don't expect it to be the land of bread and roses immediately?
Can I, if you don't mind, again, a good question, but I think we know what the UK delivers. So the UK has just delivered 250,000 people into poverty. The UK has delivered 50,000 extra children into poverty. So I know the other side of your question there that you haven't asked. I think it's for us now to start making a broader question about what this future may look like. If people don't think it's tough now, you know, it's tough now. Today is the tough time. I think that we need, and this is political parties need to, but rather maybe YesCymru, need to start mapping out the vision of what better looks like. I don't personally subscribe to this time period of danger, because I don't think we need to be that way. But actually, I really see the danger in staying in the UK. I am, unlike Phil, I wasn't a supporter of independence. I came to independence when I realised the UK was finished, because it wasn't delivering anything, and it's just got worse and worse and worse. And when you see a Labour government come into power, and I'm trying not to be party political, when you see a party you expect to change things, do the same things that they would do, that's a Westminster problem, and it's impacting on Wales. And people are starting to see it. This survey was done before the spring statement came out. I think if we repeated it now today, when people understood the amount of what's happening to put people into poverty, it would be even more for independence. But now we need to craft what better looks like. There's, you know, Plaid Cymru, I think, needs to really give this some thought, because it needs to be hopeful and it needs to be realistic as well, because the thing is being opened now, the space is being opened, and maybe that's being opened by reform and others. We need to jump into that and be bold and look at things as taking less time than people might think.
Just one more question from me. I'm very interested in this other question about linking independence to rejoining the EU. Of course, rejoining the EU when the rest of Britain or the rest of the UK was still outside the EU would be problematic, because you'd have to have a land border, wouldn't you? And obviously in any referendum that would be something that would be very heavily emphasised by the opponents of independence. So how do you deal with a situation where you would have potentially an independent Wales that was in the EU and a remainder UK that was outside it? Because that would create problems, wouldn't it?
Well, I think we've seen it with Ireland, for example, and they manage it, and there's many options of what independence could look like, and we can still have a relationship with our neighbours and make those agreements and develop that as it goes on. I don't think we're limited. I think that has to be a negotiation as that process would develop, really.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's traditionally something, it's an argument that's thrown in to put people off the idea of independence. Quite often is this sort of bogeyman of hard border, it doesn't have to be that way at all. There can be a soft border, people travel to work and, with family connections every day, between Wales and England. And there's no reason to suppose that, would change in any way at all. So it's not a real problem at all. And going back to the previous question, if I may, Martin, about an initial period of austerity post-independence. Well, aren't we already there? People throw up things like, there'll be people begging on the streets. Well, hang on, we've already got that. When I was growing up, I'd have to go to Cardiff or Swansea to see people begging on the streets, and now it's everywhere. So I see it in Merthyr as well. And then, this idea of, if we're truly better together, as they say, why aren't we better already? Because they've had enough time, haven't they, to deliver on this, and they haven't, quite frankly.
Can I add to that? Because the shop we're in today, Eto, in Barry, is here to help young parents be able to primarily find clothes for their children. Now that's a great thing that happens, and I think it's all testament to the people behind it. But that wasn't something that was needed in the generation that we were just talking about, the older generation. So this is a requirement to live that we're having to put these things in place. So I think there's, talking to Phil's point, they've had a long time, and we're seeing the consequences, and they're getting more and more. This is an acute emergency that I think we've got to jump into.
So, Mark, obviously you've been working with the group to bring the independent march here in a couple of weeks, and you've been engaging with people locally. What's the reaction been to people in your ward and in Barry to independence and the prospect of independence?
So I think this is one of the things. So Barry's an interesting place. So I've said this a lot to people recently, is that at the point when we win the debate in Barry and places like Bridgend and places like that, we win. So the independent. So if we went to Carnarvon and asked people there, it'd be 90% support independence. It's not the case here. So we've got a battle to be able to have. I think people are actually generally really interested in what's going on. So it's probably this thing like, this will be interesting. It looks as though we're going to have the best indie market for any of the marches so far. If anybody else who says Cardiff was better. So we've got more stalls, we've got our own cups, we've got things that make it interesting. It's a carnival atmosphere. So I think the question will be after this, and after they've heard some of the speeches, I wonder what people will think then. But today, Barry, as in other places, won't be an independent support in town. got Plaid Cymru councillors, as you know, Nathan, in this community who are growing. So we're on the roll, we're on the way up. And if these stats, as Phil said, we've gone up 4 percentage points in a year. This movement has gone, so in 2016, this was a sub 10% movement. Looking at it like for like, it's now a 41% movement. I don't think there are many places in the world that have shown this sort of movement. I think that's the UK is falling apart. You know, Brexit, COVID, you know, we've had these things that stood out to us, and I think this latest, the way that spring statement and other things are happening, you know, cuts to winter fuel allowance, this is the next stage of it. What's missing is us making the case, and I think I'd like to do that. We need to do that community by community by community, so councillor by councillor, etc., etc.
And you mentioned this is the 8th March now. Have you seen a positive change in those communities since those marches have happened in previous years? And do you hope that'll be the same, as Mark said, in Barry?
Yes, is the short answer. I think the marches themselves, they're a barometer of where we're at that point with regard to the independence movement and membership, and then the growth of local groups around Wales, because this is a bugbear of mine when people in all parts of Wales will point at people in other parts of Wales in a disparaging way. And, you know, people in South Wales will say, oh, people in North Wales are different, see, you know, they're not like you and me, and vice versa. So you got this going on all over Wales, and of course we know it's a nonsense, that we're a nation of very, very similar communities. You know, we've got shared values and shared problems and issues, and I think as the late Ed Butler said in Merthyr back in 2019, there's far more that binds us together than keeps us apart. And I think the Crown Estate campaign is a perfect example of that. So far we've got 100% record on that, and I think there's only 3 authorities in Wales now yet to pass a motion in support. So that's Torfaen, Newport and Pembrokeshire. So I think that, probably more than anything else, really emphasises that we are a nation and not just a region of the UK.
How does social media platforms negatively and positively affect this conversation, and do you see that happening in that sphere?
Yeah, I think it's harder on social media now since, for example, like Elon Musk has taken over X. The content there is so far to the right and so UK oriented and pushing certain things, especially towards young men. And then I know on TikTok, for example, I went into a school recently to speak to them and asked about TikTok and how many of you have seen Rhys Biodawerth on your TikTok, and a few hands went up. How many of you have seen Nigel Farage, and every hand goes up. So I think social media actually makes it harder sometimes because it pushes the content that the owners of these platforms want to be pushed, and while it plays a role in reaching young people, I think ultimately having networks of young people in the movement and being active in the movement is more valuable than just posting on social media, although it does still have a role.
And how would you encourage that age group to think about independence as something they could take on as a responsibility for themselves, as well as being part of something? Yeah,
I think it's about looking after each other, isn't it? It's like, let's build up the Wales we want to see. We want it to be independent, but let's look after each other. Let's volunteer in our local communities. Let's do litter picks. Let's help each other, and that plays a role in achieving an independent nation. Is when we have a nation of people who support and care for each other, and that should be like a founding principle of an independent Wales, really.
Yeah.
Any other questions at all?
Can I ask one?
Yeah.
So, Mark, you touched briefly just now about the 50,000 children that are about to be put in poverty due to the summer statement. 1 in 3 in Wales children are already in poverty. You've touched on the shop that we run here and why it's a necessity at the moment. We've run a couple of businesses now, Awesome Wales obviously, which was the refill shop, and now we've moved over to the more of the children's side of it. we'd like to get to a stage where this is a shop that's wanted. So it's for people who want to not put clothes in landfill, not to put toys, pushchairs in landfill that have still got life left, not one that's needed because parents can't afford to clothe their baby when they're born. How do you think independence itself would? I've seen that obviously Plaid have announced their child payment. There's no meat being put on the bones yet. The topic is great. How do you think it would improve if we were independent?
Governing is about priorities, and I think that one of the biggest, my main priority, if I was in government, would be to focus on child poverty. I think it's an abhorrence that we have a situation where, almost 40% of our children are in poverty, and it's growing. And that's a direct result. So Westminster could change some of that. So it could get rid of the 2-child cap today, and it would take a huge swathe of them off. But they put more people in. So we have the ability to solve these things today. If the UK won't do it, and it won't, then we've got to do it, and we will. It's about priorities, and I think for me, and I think for a number of other people, it's probably the biggest single priority.
Anything else?
Can I ask just a short question? When I talk to people about independence, there's only ever one response that you get when they're anti-independence, and that is that we can't afford it. What are we doing in order to explain to people that we can afford it, and how do you say we can afford it?
Well, I think traditionally there's been a lot of not just misinformation, but a lack of any meaningful information about the Welsh economy, because it's so tied up with the UK economy, of course. So it has been very difficult to get data that is specific to Wales and Wales's GDP. But that being said, we're at a time now where economists have looked at this and they have been able to extract that data. So people like, for example, Dr. John Ball, if you get a chance to see him speak at all, please do, because he makes a fantastic case for the economic argument for an independent Wales. And Professor Doyle of Dublin University as well, I think it was last year, came out with the revelation that the predicted deficit of Wales is much, much lower than we've been led to believe. So we're poor now. So it's a sliding scale, really, isn't it? I mean, are we happy with where we are now? And do we want things to, the potential for things to improve, which obviously is something that we all firmly believe in, and that's what independence would give us.
So I'm just going to add, if I may. So states that were always dependent on the UK have left over the last 100 years, and none of them have come back. And when states like Malta, when they went independent, the UK said Malta can't afford to be an independent nation, and it could. It's now thriving as part of the EU. So I think you've got a situation where Project Fear is behind that question. For us, I think what we also need to do is to define the society we want. People think the economy is the thing that defines how you do things. What we need to be doing is saying this is the society we want. So going back to the question we've just had about child poverty, the society in independent Wales should should have no child poverty. No child should be born into poverty. That should be almost a guiding principle. And then you set the economy that goes alongside it. These are things that are within they're within the wit of man. So the economy is a social construct. So the state makes the economy work or doesn't work in different ways. At the moment, we allow the UK economy to create billionaires without them paying the same rate of tax as any of us three would do. And these are the sorts of things that quite easily we could do something about, and in Wales we could do something about as well. This isn't rocket science, and lots of other countries have gone before us. It's time for Wales to stand up and take its place amongst nations of the world.
Is YesCymru doing anything to educate the populace, though, on this very subject?
Only every day, Dennis. This is what else do we do? It's part of the conversations that we have. you know, and we try to get more data, but as Mark says, you know, a lot of it is just common sense and common decency and the sort of society then that we want to see, and the realization that the current model is never going to deliver that. So,
Well said.
You make it sound like we have a David and Goliath situation here. So the billionaires in control of social media get a message across, convincing people of one possibility. But I think YesCymru is saying the probability is much different.
definitely, and I think as well, it's all about us now. You know that classic scene in The Wizard of Oz, you know, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Well, we're the ones shouting from the rooftops about the man behind the curtain, and we're going to make sure that these conversations now do happen.
There's a picture, David Elverin from Carnarvon. He's a data mapping expert, and he's got this one map of Wales, of Onydd Cymru, and it shows Wales with the interconnecting rivers of Wales. And some of them are really bright because they're well connected and places are really well, and the connections are there, and some of them are quite weak. And I think it's the job of organisations like YesCymru and others to start digging out those riverbeds that have been allowed to run dry and connecting people. Social media, I think Kiera said it perfectly, and Kiera's of the generation that uses social media. Social media won't win this. Welsh people will win this, and it'll be one by one conversation each. And I think the issue of the economy needs to be put in a point where we actually start to take it away and start, tell me the society you want. Because if the economy is more important than child poverty, this isn't the game that we should be playing. That's the crux of this. Once we start agreeing that, you can start moving on.
Brilliant. So yeah, I think that's everything. Thank you. My name's Kiera Marshall, and it's been great chatting to you both today. Looking forward to the march at the end of April.